So the topic of this presentation, JBoss EAP 6, JBoss for the enterprise, question mark. I'm going to talk about basically JBoss, why historically JBoss has been a bit crap in enterprise deployments, and then talk about some of the features that will hopefully in JBoss EAP 6 or JBoss 7 make it easier to use JBoss at a large scale. It's not massively technical in terms of the slides, but if you've got questions, ask me and I'll do my best to answer. If anything's not clear in the slides or anything that I talk about isn't clear, please ask questions. If I'm talking too fast, it's not because I'm nervous, it's because I haven't had any lunch, so pizza sounds really, really tempting. And convincing my brain that if I finish quickly, I don't get pizza any quicker, it doesn't really work. So just ask me to slow down. So I'm Matt Brasier, I'm the Head of Consulting at C2B2. I have 10 years-ish experience with JBoss, so from some pretty early JBoss versions. Also 10 years experience with other application servers, primarily WebLogic, but bits and pieces with OC4J and things like that. So if you have questions about other application servers and how, or if you have questions about how JBoss compares to other application servers, or this looks like it's ripped off from this application server, is that what they've done type questions, then just ask. I'm a professional services consultant and have been doing consulting around application servers for a number of years, 7 years or something now, including sometime subcontracting for Red Hat as a professional services consultant, so a reasonable amount of understanding of JBoss. And we've done a lot of stuff with large customers, so that varies from some of you guys in here who are customers through to government organisations who have deployments with JBoss with many thousands of nodes, or thousands of nodes, maybe not many thousands of nodes. And I've been following the development of JBoss EAP 6 or AS7 quite closely since it was first announced. The early announcements, I heard some early podcasts essentially that talked about the features that they wanted. In some ways that rang bells, and I went, yeah, I've heard about all of these features before because they're all in this application server or this application server or this application server. So in some ways it was just how are they going to do this? Are they going to do it different to other application servers? But a lot of it was, well, why didn't you do this years ago? Like, you spent years telling everybody that you didn't need this and it was an unnecessary feature, and then now you're like, actually, we're adding all of these features. But I followed the development quite closely, so I have an idea of some of the reasons design decisions were made. I've got some fairly strong opinions on places where I think they've still made the wrong decision, but only time will tell. And C2B2, as most of you know, we're sponsoring running the London JBoss User Group, and we're a high-end enterprise Java consulting company, and we are independent, although the focus of this talk is JBoss. It's a JBoss User Group, it's not a JBoss sales presentation, so feel free to slag off JBoss as much as you want or ask hard questions about it. And it's find a seat somewhere. So, kind of things I want to talk about then. So the problem space, so what was wrong with JBoss earlier versions, why did they need to do anything? JBoss EAP 6 is a very drastic change from previous versions of JBoss. It's really obvious to anybody who gets hold of it and unzips it. I have an install on my laptop that I can show people later if they've not seen the EAP 6 at all. The directory structure is completely different, the file structures are different. Just the whole architecture is completely different, as we'll see from some of the slides later on. So there was obviously, they must have realised that something was wrong and that they needed to attack this whole application server thing from a completely different angle. And EAP 6 is the result of that, but why? What was it that was wrong? I'll talk about some of the core features of EAP 6, so it's more about the architecture of EAP 6 than the features. We're talking about how things are done differently and what impact this has on the ability to run large JBoss deployments, and then a bit about the impact of that. So, what was the problem? What was wrong with EAP 5? Well, where do I start? So, let's start with a history lesson. JBoss, So the name JBoss Through Time was a pun on a computer game, Repton Through Time on the BBC Micro, which I had as one of my first computer games that I owned in like 1984, so it's probably completely lost on everybody here, but I found it amusing when I made the slide. So, JBoss was the first open source EJB container. They built it, the guys who built it they built it because they could, rather than because there was a business driver to it or because there was a business need for it. They basically went, this EJB specification looks quite good, let's have a go at writing an application server. And they did a really good job, given that there were a couple of guys who decided to have a go at it. They then built it up into an application server. They added existing components like Tomcat or Jetty, you could pick early on which you had as a server container. Various other components, so logging libraries like Log4j, there were bits of various other components in there, a lot of which have eventually become part of JBoss, but which at the time were independent libraries, so there's a lot of stuff to do with Hibernate in there, a lot of stuff to do with various transaction management libraries, Arduino and so forth. It was always a very developer-focused product, so it was always very early to market with features that developers liked, that made development easy with it. But there was always very little take-up in enterprise industry and large-scale companies for various reasons. So I just wanted to do a quick poll here. There's not that many here, and if there's multiple people from the same company, it's probably only interesting for one person. But how many JBoss servers have people got operational? So anyone who's got around up to 5 JBoss servers live, put their hands up. So that's a couple. Up to 10, so 5 to 10 JBoss servers in production. No. 10 to 100 JBoss servers in production. You guys. And 100 or 100 plus or 1,000. Yeah, and anyone more than 1,000? No. So mostly the biggest concentration was in the kind of up to 5 or 5 to 100 kind of level. And then how many users, so I'll skip through some of the brackets on this, but who has less than 100 users on their system? Anybody here? Between 100 and 1,000? Couple? More than 1 million? Or between 1,000 and 1 million? No, more than 1 million? No. So nobody has public-facing systems running on JBoss in which the entire world is your potential users. So again, they're focused fairly low down that scale in terms of potential numbers of users. And then how frequently do people patch their applications? So this is your business applications. Anybody roll out patches weekly? No? Monthly? Yeah, a couple. Bi-monthly? Yeah, every 6 months or 12 months? No, and you can see a trend. So the people who have larger numbers of users, more JBoss servers, roll out their patches much less frequently. That's fairly understandable because you have a bigger organisation, you need less churn in your application, you need more stability. It's harder to pick a time when you're not going to impact users, so if you have millions of users and the whole world is your potential user base, pretty much any time you pick, somebody is going to be wanting to use your application, or hopefully going to be wanting to use your application. As we kind of saw at this side of the room, 5 to 10 servers in production, probably hundreds rather than thousands of users, probably running update cycles in the range of kind of every month or so, updating their application. This contrasts with some of the larger enterprises, so you guys getting into that side where hundreds to thousands of servers, thousands or millions of users, or at least high hundreds of users, updates much less frequently. They have quite a lot of money, which is what Red Hat is mostly interested in, but they're not your traditional JBoss user. So, why are they not a JBoss user? Why don't they like using it? Well, first of all, we can look at the benefits of JBoss. And this gives us an idea of what the problems may be or where they need to start working to tackle this. So, pluggability, the application server is really a container for services. You can swap and change services It may require quite a lot of XML configuration or code hacking or whatever, but you've got the ability to do that because it's an open source product. You can see the source. So if you want to change your server container from Tomcat to Jetty or something similar, you can do that. You can go in there and make that change. More likely, people sometimes change JMS containers and use something other than JBoss messaging, or in fact, JBoss later versions of JBoss EAP 5. You can choose between Hornet Queue or JBoss messaging as your implementation out of the box. So there's a lot of choice for the implementation of a particular service that you use. You can kind of build your own application server out of some of the components. It's also free to use if you use the community versions, and the enterprise versions are not that expensive compared to the licensing costs of some of their competitors. Obviously there are different vendors will give you different total cost of ownership figures based on whichever one makes them look best, but in general the licensing of JBoss is pretty cheap compared to licensing of competitors, or the subscriptions to JBoss are cheap compared to the licensing of competitors. Technically it's free to change in terms of editing the code, but how many of you here would actually consider editing the JBoss source code and then rolling that through to live? Probably not that many. I know the JBoss source code very well, and I would be very hesitant to do it in anything other than a tiny little bug fix that was really obvious, just because it is such a complex system to understand the interactions or the knock-on effects that some tiny change in one component can have is really complicated. And you can actually see that yourself just looking at the bugs that occur in various versions of JBoss. You can quite often look and you'll see, okay, I've found that this bug occurs in this version and it didn't occur in previous versions, and you trace through and you find that it was a patch to some other component in some other service that was fixing a bug elsewhere has caused the bug here. So there's a lot of that stuff that goes on in JBoss 4 around security. There's whole swathes of patches that step on top of each other in terms of allowing certain features to work but breaking other features, and then those patches get reverted so that the other patches work, and they put another set of patches in that break it again, and it just kind of flip-flops between this set of features working or this set of features working, depending who happened to commit changes most recently. So it's also, JBoss is community driven, especially the community version, but there is a lot of take up in the community and a lot of drive from the community. So if the community makes a lot of noise and says what we really want is OSGI containers within our application server so that we can deploy OSGI bundles with our applications, then the developers take that on board and then it ends up in the application server. You can also do stuff yourself, so while we've never really, or wouldn't really consider changing the source code too much, you might develop a module or a plugin or something like that for JBoss that you would then submit back to Red Hat, and they quite often pick that stuff up. So there is a big kind of community-driven aspect to it, which is really kind of one of the things that people choose to use JBoss for. But these are all benefits that appeal to developers rather than benefits that appeal to great big companies. So the disadvantages of using JBoss, it has a lot of configuration files. Anybody who tries to do much JBoss administration will know that if you want to change the SSL certificates for the Tomcat configuration, you do them in one place. If you want to do some configuration of security for JBoss messaging and JMS queues, then you do that in a different XML file, and all of these different files basically make it quite complicated. There's no concept of central configuration, not even for a single server, so a server doesn't have its own single configuration file, so there's no way that you could say, right, I've got 100 servers and I want them to all read their configuration from this central location. That's just, with JBoss 5, not really going to happen in a consistent way. The community are developers, and the developers are developers. So they tend to put it together as a product, throw it out the door and say, there you go guys, there's an application server. we're going to go and work on the next version now, and we'll add some awesome features for you. But if you've got bugs, or you find bugs, then good luck with that, and we'll fix it in JBoss 9 or something like that. So it's got a reputation, it's not as bad now, and obviously the enterprise platform versions are much better because you can raise support, but certainly with the community versions, you're never really going to get a patch in the version that you're using. You're going to get a patch in the next version coming. The developers are mostly going to be interested in delivering a patch if it's to a new feature, if it's a patch to a feature that's been around for ages that nobody, or that they don't find particularly sexy. They're not going to be that interested in looking at it. And administration features are not and have never been prioritised. I had a conversation with the ex-CTO, Sasha, of JBoss many years ago, probably 5 years ago at the JBoss Partner Summit, where he asked for questions from partners, and I said, what are you going to do about administration, because you have no decent administration tooling? And he didn't really have an answer. He talked a bit about JBoss Operations Network, which was released at the time, but has never been pushed as a product. There has never been a really big drive to make people aware that it exists, to educate users into using it as their primary method of managing JBoss. And even beyond that, the developers have never, they're developers, they like writing tools that they think other developers will find exciting. They're not so interested in writing tools that they think administration staff or operations staff are going to find exciting. So you just need to look at the JBoss admin consoles, the web admin consoles through time, and they've slowly added more buttons, but still very feature poor. So the JMX console, which does pretty much anything you could want it to do, but it's almost impossible to find the right button to click. And then they added the web console, which was just an applet down the side of the JMX console to put things in a slightly more logical tree structure. Then the JBoss 5 console, which was based on the RxQ tooling. And it was kind of okay, but there were a couple of funny features, like the ability that there was a restart button next to a server, and you click that and the server shuts down and never comes back up again, because it was based on RxQ and it expected to have an agent that would be able to shut the server down and then start it up again. And without an agent running externally, you just click restart and it shuts itself down, and then obviously it's dead, can't start itself up again. So there were various funny things in there, and that never really did anything. And again, the version, so the console that came with JBoss 5 could only manage a single JBoss instance, and that's because there is no central configuration. So there is no design, there's no architecture that allows it to have a central configuration repository and to push the changes out to other servers. And because there are so many configuration files, it was even too difficult for the developers of the admin console to come up with a reliable way of allowing you to make changes and persist them back to configuration files. So they basically gave up on that, and most of the stuff that you could do in the console was read-only, just because they couldn't guarantee that if they tried to write it back to the files, they wouldn't corrupt your JBoss instance for you. Those were the disbenefits or the problems with JBoss, and these are mostly things that impact operations teams. So we see JBoss has benefits for developers and it has problems for operations teams. As we kind of been through, but summarising again, so there's so many configuration files. If you've got junior administration team that's responsible for managing JBoss and probably Apache servers and that kind of thing, maybe some databases like the second line support team, it's pretty much impossible to say, here are some instructions for doing some stuff with JBoss if things fail. You need to have some kind of developer or backline support team that can manage it. It's really complicated to get consistency across sets of servers, and you can't really manage large numbers of servers. So most people come up with some shell scripts that will SSH into all 40 JBoss servers and start them, or SSH into them all and stop them, or that kind of thing. But it's left to the developer to do, and again, there's no kind of solid way of doing it, no best practices around it. So in large organisations, the operations teams often get quite a large say in what technologies are going to be used, because those are the guys that are going to support that system for the next 10 years or whatever the life cycle of that application is. So the developers come along and they spend a year or two writing it, but the support team traditionally has not a massive budget, but they have the budget to take it on. And they also have the ability to refuse quite often to take on a system that they don't see as supportable, which pushes a lot of power their way in terms of saying what they consider to be supportable, what technologies get used and that type of thing. Traditionally, the support team falls under some kind of IT services, director of technology, kind of leadership structure, and development teams are under a similar structure, but off under some project or program type system where the line to the money is a bit more complicated. So JBoss has historically been unattractive to operations teams. In large companies, operations teams have a bit more power and money than in small companies, and the large companies are the ones with the money. So turning the problem upside down, we can see the solution is to make JBoss to make money for Red Hat. They have to make JBoss attractive to operations teams. So the goals then for JBoss EAP 6 or JBoss 7, the biggest goals that they talked about really were solving this big manageability problem, because it was beginning to hurt them as well as their customers. They were starting to find that actually somebody would write a component for JBoss, like a new messaging implementation or some new transaction management implementation, and find that they're conflicting with some component that someone else is using, which is using a different version of a Xerxes library or a different version of Spring or something like that. They got themselves in such a muddle from having all of these separate projects tied together with a couple of XML files that they began to feel the pain themselves. So in addressing that, they had to essentially address the whole thing. So they wanted the ability to manage and configure multiple JBoss servers centrally. If you're familiar with other application servers, you'll be familiar with that concept. You have a central configuration repository. Other instances start up, go to that central repository and say, I need a copy of the configuration and this is my server identity or whatever, and they get a copy of the bit that they need. This is good for anybody that isn't basically a bedroom coder, so unless your goal in life is to run a single JBoss instance with a web app for your local church or pub or whatever it is you like to do in the evenings, then it's a good idea for you because it simplifies a lot of things. And the main question, or not question, but the thing that I keep asking is why has it taken this long? So the biggest changes, the biggest features, the first one is that JBoss now has a single central configuration file. All of the configuration for JBoss is in a single file. That's either standalone XML if you're running a single standalone JBoss instance, or it's domain XML if you're running a domain, which is this feature where you can have multiple servers with a central configuration. They've introduced this concept of domains as an overarching configuration concept, really. I'm not sure architect was the word, I'm not sure artifact was the word I wanted. I think concept is a better word. So domains allow you to configure, manage, deploy to and control multiple JBoss servers, all from a single central point. So this domain XML contains the configuration for every JBoss server in that domain, and when an instance starts up, it goes to the domain controller and says, I am an instance of my app server 1, please give me the relevant configuration, and it gets sent back. Because they've done the changes necessary to have this single configuration file, that becomes quite simple. It also means they can do other things with administration tools later on, like now that they've got a sensible schema, they can actually have an administration tool that allows you to change any configuration anywhere in the application and save it and have that persistent. So you can kind of see this massive chunk of XML. This is a standalone XML file. It's a bit slow zooming and stuff on this because it's quite large, so I'm just going to show a few fragments. So at the top, it defines a bunch of modules that get loaded. So JBoss EAP 6 or JBoss 7 has taken a modular approach, and all of the components are defined in modules, and each module has a descriptor that defines what jar files make up that module. So this extension module of JBoss AS Kojo means that JBoss will go off and look in the modules directory, and it will go down the directory org/jboss/as/kojo, and it will look for a JBoss modules XML file that will tell it what it needs to do to load that module. So we have modules for the various things, web application, threading, security, remoting, OSGI, naming, JMX, EJB3, deployment scanning, all of the kind of services you would expect in an application server. You'll also see in this file we have data source definitions. So previously JBoss used to have DS XML files that defined each data source. They've now gone down the approach of having all of your data sources defined in this one big XML file, which to me is a little interesting because the other application servers have recently gone in the other direction of having all of the configuration except for data sources and JMS queues in a single configuration file, and then each JMS queue or data source is defined in a separate file. But this is the approach that JBoss have gone for now. So we've got an example data source. So they've changed from using Hypersonic to H2 as their embedded database. I'm not sure it's any better or worse, but Hypersonic was pretty awful. So data source configuration, driver configuration are in here.
So you do all the configuration in one file?
In one single file, yeah.
Rather than split it up.
Exactly, yeah. So as well as data sources, we've got all the socket binding information, so AJP port, HTTP port, HTTPS port, OSGI management port, remoting ports, socket binding called Bob on 8081. I think that was me playing around probably. There is some management interfaces. So 9990, 9999, 9443. So it has a separate management interface to its external web interface. So you can expose your management interface essentially over only your LAN or WAN or some subnet, and then have the external ports as routable information. So you could bind this to a different address or bind it to different ports or use firewall rules or whatever. So when you go and do any administration stuff, whether that's command line or via the admin console, you're using these management ports, not the public facing ports here. In this configuration file is all of your deployment archives. So every application that gets deployed gets an entry in here. So this sampleapp.war with the name sampleapp.war has a unique content ID, and there's a mapping in this file as well, so that it says which servers have which content IDs mapped. So you can map. This would list all of your deployments, but they're not all targeted to all servers. So these IDs are used further up in the file to say this server has the content item 9F67CF blah 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 deployed to it. So it's quite a hefty file, the standalone XML. It's got, as I said, every piece of configuration in the domain in there. There are no other configuration files essentially in JBoss, or not any serious ones. So how did they get to this point? I've essentially rewritten major parts of the application server, starting with the core. They have a completely new architecture, a new server architecture and deployment architecture that essentially presents JBoss as this single application server product with a single configuration file, single administration console, a much more sensible directory structure. But multiple processes are involved. So those of you familiar with, say, WebLogic, which has this concept of a node manager as an external process that runs, that can start and stop WebLogic instances. Red Hat have something similar but a bit more complicated. You can't really read the titles on these boxes. But you have a domain controller which has a repository, which is the domain XML file. It reads from there. Then there's a server manager process and a process manager process. So these are, the process manager is a very lightweight process, and the server manager is also kind of a lightweight process. The server manager, or the process manager starts processes, so it can start servers, it can start service managers. The server manager communicates with the domain controller to load the configuration for a particular server instance. and installed image is just your instance of JBoss on the disk. So you have these multiple processes that communicate in a fairly complex way. It's not too necessary to understand it, other than when you're configuring ports, you just need to know about configuring server manager ports and domain controller ports. You need to tell, so to install more instances, you could essentially take this install and copy it, and you would need to update. This would have the bindings for the local servers in there, and you need to tell it the location of the domain controller so that it knows where to go to load the configuration. I'm not too sure about the split between the process manager and the server manager, and why it couldn't just be one process. Red Hat, I've had email conversations with Red Hat about it on the developer list. I've never really got much of an answer. My personal view is that it comes down to them believing their own FUD about WebLogic's node manager being too heavyweight and unreliable. But there may be valid reasons why they've split it that way. They have tried to tell me what they are, and it doesn't go in, and it doesn't make any sense to me.
You have multiple process and server managers.
So you have, per box, you have one process manager and one server manager, but potentially multiple server processes.
Okay. And then on the host on the right, that's like and then WebLogic is the admin server.
Exactly, yes.
So it's called domain controller as well.
Yeah. So the host controller has only host-specific configuration on it. So you tell the host controller, on this box I want to start an instance of server type 1 and then 2 instances of server type 2. I want to bind them to these ports, please. You also tell it the domain controller that you go to get the configuration from these is such and such address, and it goes up and talks to them. Process controller starts and stops processes. These are lightweight process. The domain controller has all of the profiles for the whole domain. It reads all of this from domain XML. And it also runs the administration console, which is something slightly obscure that it takes a while to get used to, and I'll mention it again in a later slide. So when you want to go to the admin console, you don't connect to a JBoss instance, you connect to the domain controller, which is, I guess, does come back to this whole slide here, the thing about this, whether this is lightweight or not. This is actually running a web container, or at least the domain controller is running a web container, and the domain controller and the server manager are essentially the same bit of Java code, except that one of them has a configuration file and one of them doesn't have a configuration file, it just has the IP address of somebody else who's got a configuration file. So this is actually a fairly large process in that it does contain a web container that is running a web application that's an admin console.
Can you connect to each server web container, or can you just
only the domain?
Only the domain. The other one is disabled.
Yeah.
Is it really only for managing? So can the server run without the domain controller?
Yeah, probably they can.
Yes, the servers can run without the domain controller being up. They can't. I don't know if they can start and stop without the domain controller being up. I've never tried. It would be an interesting experiment. It might be that it won't start a new instance, but because it wouldn't have anywhere to. I don't know whether a server controller keeps a cached copy of the most recently valid profiles or not.
Well, if they follow roughly on how others work, then that's what it would.
That's what they do, but whether they've done that or not,
yeah.
I don't know. I've never tried it. So, domain mode we've kind of talked about as a set of servers that share a single configuration repository. The domain controller basically owns that configuration repository. They request their configuration from the domain controller when they start up. So the key benefit of all of this approach is that you then have a centralized configuration of all of your servers, so either in domain XML or standalone XML. You can start and stop servers remotely, so you can go to the domain controller and say, I would like to stop all of my servers. And it goes and talks to the process manager on all of the boxes and stops them all or starts them all. So you have a single point to start, stop and manage servers. You can also deploy to all of your servers. So you can say, I want to upload this web app. Here you go, through the browser. Deploy that to these 6 servers, go, and it copies it onto all 6 servers and starts it. So the key things to kind of note about this then, server configuration is based on profiles. Domain XML contains configuration for all of the server's profiles in the domain. So if you've got different types of servers, some of which have some web applications deployed, others have others, maybe some have some JMS services and others don't, then you have multiple sections in the domain XML. So domain XML contains configuration for all of the server profiles. Reading between the lines, you might have a pun there. That means that standalone XML contains only one configuration for a profile. So standalone XML just has one server profile in it. So this was the standalone XML. You can see it was quite a big XML file. We zoom out. This is a domain XML. You can see it's roughly 5 times as long as the standalone XML. I think this one has 3 server profiles in it and a whole bunch of stuff about the domain as well. So literally everything is all in that one file, or almost everything is all in that one file there. In domain mode, the admin console runs on the domain controller, not on the server, so if you want to connect to it, then you need to connect to the domain controller. This can confuse people a bit because it's different to how JBoss has done it before. So the administration stuff in JBoss was just a web app running in JBoss. Now it's essentially running in a different process. One of the questions that comes up is how does all of this domain stuff relate to clustering? And domains and clusters are completely orthogonal concepts. So a domain is a administration and configuration unit of information or of configuration, and a cluster is a runtime replication of state. So you can have a set of standalone nodes, each with its own standalone XML, that contains information that says join a cluster using these multicast details, and they will join a cluster and run their cluster. I wouldn't advise doing that because then you're back to the whole JBoss 5 system of what happens if somebody logs onto one of those boxes and accidentally changes the configuration of one node but not another node, and they stop seeing each other. But it is possible to have a cluster in a standalone domain, and a domain can contain 0 or more clusters. So you don't have to cluster servers just because they're in a domain, and it's not a one-to-one mapping between the servers in this domain or in this cluster. You could say server profile 1 defines a cluster, and all servers that are of type server profile 1 form a cluster. Server profile 2 doesn't have any clustering. Any servers that are of type server profile 2 don't cluster. Server profile 3 might have another cluster that's separate from server profile 1. So
can you have the same server in multiple clusters? So one server and 2 clusters?
probably not, I think, in that it would essentially just join the clusters together, because any state that got replicated to it would also replicate to the other servers.
And you mentioned multicast.
Yeah.
Does it support unicast?
It does support unicast, yeah.
Okay, because multicast, well, I'm trying to get rid of it.
Yeah, so it does support unicast. I haven't tried configuring, or have I? I haven't recently tried configuring a unicast cluster with JBoss 7. So one of my concerns about JBoss 7 or EAP 6, depending what you want to call it, is, we find that big XML file again. So everything is defined in this file, and there's a pretty solid schema that says what you can put in this file. And they've been fairly good at making sure that there are ways to pass things through. So if there's a property that they haven't exposed in the schema, for most things there's a way that you can pass it through. So if you're using some obscure Tomcat setting that they haven't set here, there's usually a way to pass that through. But I'm fairly sure there will be places where there aren't, where they've missed off ways to set configuration that they don't see there being a use case for, but actually some customer somewhere wants to set this flag. And just because the JBoss developers couldn't see it and didn't put it in their schema, suddenly you can't set this flag anymore. So I think there will be teething troubles around that, and I can imagine that that's maybe one of the areas where you might see that is in some of the clustering stuff. So administration tools, new admin console. It's looking better than it did in early versions of JBoss 7. It allows you to administer the whole domain, and the changes that you make with it are persistent, so you can go in and you can change. So that's where that Bob setting, there was a port setting called Bob. That was me playing around with the admin console and saying, what happens if I create a new port mapping and call it Bob, and click save, and then go in the XML file, and I was like, oh look, it's actually appeared. That's nice. So you can make persistent changes because of this single configuration file and single syntax. There's also a command line interface. They have their own management API and their own management syntax. It's pretty complicated. A lot of people are still saying, why didn't you just stick with JMX? Theirs is more powerful, but it's not really a standard, so it is kind of complicated. But it allows you to use the command line tool to go in, browse through the tree of configuration things, view configuration elements. It's kind of like a command line. You think of it like a command line JMX browser, but it's not using JMX, but you navigate through a tree of hierarchical components that all have configuration attached to them. You can do anything that you expect to be able to do with an administration tool, so change configuration, deploy stuff, and restart
So
service.
it's like the WLST then?
Yes, yeah.
Is it more complicated than WLST or is it similar?
So WLST is based on Jython, so it's kind of, that's almost a complete programming language, whereas this is more of like a shell where you can go in and CD into locations and change properties and things like that, rather than a kind of full programming language.
Is the administration console secured by login and stuff like that, or is it?
It is secured by a login. I've never tried changing it to anything more secure than its default. So by default, there is a text file essentially that stores the login information. There is, I don't think it's installed in Clear, but and there is no default user. So when you first go to the admin console, it says there isn't a user. You have to run this command to define one, and then you run that command and create a user, and it won't let you have admin, because I tried that.
Can you integrate it with like LDAP and things like that?
So I would guess you can, but I've not tried.
Still a question on the domain concept. If you have a lifecycle management over the future, can the domain contain multiple versions of JBoss?
That's a good question. I would guess not at the moment, but I imagine it's something that they might look at doing. If it's like what other application servers do, you'll probably find that the domain can contain multiple versions, but only versions that are older than the domain controller. So the domain controller has to know about all of the schema elements that might exist, and it can only know about past things, so it can know that we changed this schema element from this to this in this version, but it can't know that in the future we're going to change it to something else. So
in a domain, is there a central server.log, or do you have to look at the individual?
There are individual log files for individual servers too. Done this bit. So that's basically it. So yeah, let the fun start in terms of now it's out there, now is when we're going to start seeing real bugs come out as real users start hitting it and going, actually I wanted to set this Tomcat flag that you don't support or some other feature. So it's going to be interesting times. The development list is fairly quiet at the moment. The biggest discussion they're having at the moment is about in the next version whether the default profile for standalone XML should contain the OSGI container or not. And there's pretty much a 50-50 split between them as to whether OSGI is a core component or not. I'd imagine it will end up in there, but that's the kind of thing they're talking about at the moment. Answered yet?
Maybe as a consultant, what should be your recommendation about
moving to it?
5 to 6?
It would depend what your timescales are for deployment, I think, is probably the answer. So EAP 6 is a lot better than the early versions of JBoss 7. If it's an application that is not completely mission critical, then it's probably a reasonable thing to start looking at. If it's a mission critical application, I'd give it a while, a year or so at least, before you start
EAP
trusting it too much. EAP 7. Yeah, so
It seems like they're in between. I mean, obviously they're probably not to major changes, you said. I think they're probably in between where they find all the bugs and they, our next version will be more or less.
So they released JBoss 7, and I don't think there was that much uptake of it because it is a massive shift. And also, as I kind of talked about, the drivers for using JBoss 7 are not drivers that people who are playing with the community version, the bleeding edge community version, are going to have. So no one is going to sit there at home and go, yeah, I like using the latest version of JBoss, and I really want to try it out on my 50-node cluster with 100,000 users, because the people who try the latest version of JBoss don't have big user bases. So I think it's only now that EAP 6 has actually come out that we're going to start seeing the proper features of it being used.
Have you any comment on the difference in class loading in AS7?
Yes, it's horrible. Yes, and that was one of there's been so much, so it's not so much now, but because I think people have settled down to it, but it was the biggest complaint when the beta versions and release candidates of 7 were out, with that it's so massively different, and lots of things don't work. I know I think the first beta release, no, it wasn't even a beta release, it was 7.0.0, so the first GA release. You couldn't get resources stream, didn't work, so you couldn't load a properties file out of a jar file or an XML as a jar file as a stream, because it just couldn't find them. There's lots of problems in class loading. Most of them are probably, people know workarounds for them if you post around the various forums now, but it's massively different. So there are a lot of things about migrating an application to EAP 6 that I haven't even touched on. This is just a bit about kind of the domain structure. In terms of migrating an application, I'd also like to have more experience of people actually doing it, because most of the 7 stuff I've seen is new applications rather than migrating stuff over. So people are starting from scratch and they're going, okay, so it doesn't find the classes if I do it this way, so if I do it that way it finds the classes, and I'll just carry on that way, rather than taking a big application, dropping it on there and going, class not found, exception everywhere. But yeah, the class loading is, I'm not a massive fan of it, because in my opinion they're just getting further and further away from the standard JE class loader that WebSphere and WebLogic and everybody else in the world use in that hierarchy. The reason they've done what they're doing in 7 is because of this thing that I kind of briefly touched on, where they keep ending up using different versions of, say, Xerxes or Spring or that kind of thing. So the thing that killed JBoss Community 6 was the fact that they used a really new Xerxes parser that broke pretty much everything else, including struts. So if you had a struts application, you couldn't run it on Community 6 because struts wanted to use a different version of Xerxes, and there was no way to match that kind of dependency. So they've gone for a much more isolated class loader hierarchy, whereby one component of JBoss can use one version of Xerxes and another version can use another version of Xerxes. Then it means you deploy your application and it goes, I don't know what version of Xerxes I want, there are 4 of them here. Pick a random one and see what happens, kind of thing.
What's the sort of, is there a roadmap? How they're gonna, how they're planning to progress this? I mean,
There probably is, I haven't seen it if I'm honest.
Oh.
I don't know whether it's an internal or a partner document or a public document. There will be one, but I don't know what's in it. Anything else? There's pizza there, so.
The modules are JBoss applies, are they OSGI bundles or how?
No, not. They are not OSGI. They're not fully OSGI. They're very like OSGI, but the life cycle is a lot simplified. They support OSGI modules, so you see there is a module that allows OSGI modules to be loaded, but they've taken a simplified version of essentially the OSGI lifecycle and what's involved in OSGI and used that instead.
So OSGI container is just isolated to one module.
You can still, there is interoperability between the two, and I don't know to what extent it goes because I've not really done much with OSGI. It's not not one of the features that I kind of kick and see how it works when I'm trying it out. So I know there is integration between them because I was reading some posts on the development list last week for somebody who had an application which was part OSGI and part J2E, and he was having problems with class loading between the two. That it had worked in JBoss 5 where they'd used their own OSGI container, I think, and then when they moved to using the JBoss one, the problem was deployment ordering of the Java EE EJBs, that the OSGI components start up in a specific order, but they also expect the EJBs to start up in a specific order, and they didn't. The EJBs started up in a random order, and it's not the same each time you start JBoss. So that was the problem they were having, was that even if they then redid their OSGI components to start up in a different order, the next time they started up, the EJB started in a different order and broke everything again.
The process manager and server manager, is that two separate processes which run on the server?
Yes.
And then they stop and kill processes and
Yes.
so they start and stop processes.
Yeah.
And how do those get started?
They sometimes run in the same JVM.
Do they?
So they're two separate processes. Like if you're running in standalone mode, then they're all in the same JVM, so they're different threads essentially.
They made it two separate things.
In a domain, I think they're two separate things when they get started up. There's a script that starts. I think the script starts the process manager, which starts the server manager.
So you would obviously put that into your service, and then those two will start. Okay, and then through that you start the service. So you're not sure if you can just start the servers, the managed servers.
I don't think you can start standalone. I think their life cycle is dependent on having a process manager, but that process manager can be in the same JVM, which is I think how standalone mode works.
But then on the server, can't you just invoke the servers using the process manager? I'm not sure. Maybe through the command line?
You could do it through the command, the admin tool command.
Admin tool.
The command scripting tool thing.